400 Mafia bosses watched in silence as Bumpy Johnson walked into a wedding and ended Carlo Gambino's empire with a single gift. September 12, 1953, St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, Little Italy. The church had never seen power like this. 400 men filled the pews, tailored suits, stone-cold faces, quiet authority. These weren't politicians or businessmen. They were the architects of America's underworld. Every major mafia family in New York was present. This was no ordinary wedding. Carlo Gambino's nephew stood at the altar, smiling confidently. To be related to Carlo Gambino was to be protected by the most feared man in organized crime. No one touched his blood. No one questioned his authority. The priest cleared his throat and began the vows. That's when the doors opened, slowly. The sound echoed through the cathedral like a gunshot. A single man stepped inside, and the weight of history followed him through the cathedral doors. No entourage flanked him, no bodyguards scanned the room, and not a trace of fear touched his stride. It was Bumpy Johnson. The Harlem kingpin moved down the center aisle as if the building itself had been constructed for his arrival, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. Under his arm rested a neatly wrapped gift box, modest in size, almost innocent in appearance, yet heavy with implication. The organ music faltered, then died completely, the final note hanging in the air like a held breath. 400 heads turned in unison, faces freezing mid-smile, mid-prayer, mid-whisper. The bride's veil trembled slightly as she turned, confused murmurs rippling through the pews. Whispers spread like wildfire, sharp and panicked, bouncing from bench to bench. What is he doing here? He wasn't invited. Is he insane? This was supposed to be a sacred moment, a carefully controlled gathering of bloodlines and alliances, not a stage for provocation. Men shifted uncomfortably, hands brushing against concealed weapons out of instinct before remembering where they were. The guards near the doors hesitated, uncertain whether moving now would ignite something far worse than a breach of etiquette. At the altar, Carlo Gambino rose slowly, the motion deliberate, the fury on his face barely contained behind years of practiced composure. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as he stared down the aisle at the uninvited guest who dared to disrupt his family ceremony. "You've got some nerve," Gambino said loudly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is a family ceremony." Every word carried authority, a warning wrapped in formality. Bumpy stopped halfway down the aisle and smiled, not a mocking grin, but a calm, almost warm expression that unsettled the room more than open hostility ever could. He looked around, meeting eyes without flinching, acknowledging old rivals, silent allies, and frightened onlookers alike. "I brought a gift," he said calmly, his voice steady, measured, as if he were announcing a toast rather than challenging a king. "And I never miss a moment like this." A murmur surged again, louder now, edged with disbelief. The audacity of it all pressed down on the room. This was not just a man attending uninvited. This was a statement, a declaration made without shouting or threats. Bumpy took another step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, forcing everyone present to confront the reality of his presence. Memories flickered through the minds of the older men, memories of deals struck in smoke-filled rooms, of territory lines drawn and redrawn, of bodies that vanished when lines were crossed. The bride clutched her bouquet tighter, sensing she had become a footnote in a much older, darker story unfolding before her eyes. Gambino's fingers curled into his palm, his control tested as his authority was challenged in front of his entire world. Yet he did not give the order, not here, not now, because everyone understood the truth in that moment. Bumpy Johnson had not come by accident, and he had not come to beg permission. He had come to remind them all that even in a room filled with power, there were still men who answered to no invitation, no rule, and no fear. Bumpy reached the altar, his footsteps steady, unhurried, each one echoing through the cathedral like a countdown. The bride was trembling now, her fingers white as they clutched the bouquet, petals bending under the pressure. The groom's smile had completely vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of disbelief and fear. The priest, pale and sweating, instinctively stepped back, murmuring a broken prayer as if holy words could shield him from what was unfolding. This was no longer a wedding, it was a reckoning. Bumpy paused before the altar, the sacred space now occupied by a man who treated power with the same reverence others reserved for God. He gently placed the gift box on the polished surface, careful, almost respectful, as if the contents deserved dignity. The room leaned forward without realizing it, every breath held, every heartbeat loud in the silence. "This is for the commission," Bumpy said, his voice low but perfectly clear, his eyes never leaving Carlo Gambino. There was no anger in his tone, no triumph, only certainty. Gambino's response was a sharp, humorless laugh that cracked through the tension. "You think you can embarrass me in my own church?" he snapped, spreading his arms slightly as if to remind everyone whose domain this was, whose name carried weight here. Bumpy nodded once, a small motion that somehow felt heavier than a shouted threat. "Yes." One word, no explanation, no apology. He reached for the lid and opened the box. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, yet it landed like thunder. Inside were documents stacked with deliberate care, ledgers thick with handwritten figures, photographs sealed in envelopes, corners worn from being studied too many times, wire transcripts neatly labeled, shipping manifests stamped and dated, names, numbers, dates, routes, payments, signatures, the architecture of betrayal laid bare. This was not rumor, this was not accusation, this was proof, absolute proof. Carlo Gambino had been running a massive, unauthorized, multi-million-dollar operation in Harlem, siphoning money through shell companies, rerouting shipments, skimming profits before they were ever reported. He had cut out other families, violated agreements sealed in blood and silence, and lied directly to the commission while smiling at their tables. The implications spread through the room faster than whispers ever could. Men recognized their own handwriting. Others recognized faces in the photographs, meetings they thought had gone unseen, conversations they believed were buried forever. A few felt the cold realization that they had been used, manipulated, or quietly robbed. Gambino's laughter died in his throat as his eyes scanned the contents, his confidence cracking for the first time. His jaw tightened, but there was no denial, because denial would have been an insult to the intelligence of everyone present. The whispers stopped completely. Silence crushed the room, heavy and suffocating, even the bride's trembling stilled, as if instinct told her not to move. This silence was different from fear. It was the sound of power shifting, of balance recalibrating itself. Bumpy straightened, hands resting calmly at his sides, not needing to say another word. He had not come to argue, he had come to expose. In that moment, in a church meant to celebrate unity, the truth stood naked on the altar, and everyone understood that nothing leaving this room would ever be the same again. One by one, the mob bosses stood, chairs scraping softly against stone floors that had witnessed centuries of vows, confessions, and now silent verdicts. No one shouted, no one reached for a weapon. There were no dramatic threats, no raised voices, no need for theater. Each man stepped forward, lifted a document from the open box, and began to read. Eyes moved left to right, brows tightened, lips pressed thin. Some paused longer than others, rereading figures they hoped were wrong, dates they prayed were forged, signatures they wished were not real, but they were real, and they understood. This wasn't an accusation built on rumor or ego. This was a completed equation, a balance sheet of betrayal, a ledger that did not lie. In their world, guns ended lives, but paper ended empires. Breaking commission rules was unforgivable, not because of morality, but because order was survival. The rules were the only thing separating structure from chaos. Betrayal meant removal, not in rage, but with precision. Power did not protect you from consequences, power only delayed them. Carlo Gambino remained standing near the altar, his back straight, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles burned white. The color drained slowly from his face as realization settled in. This was not something he could talk his way out of. These men were not looking at him anymore, they were looking past him, already recalculating futures where his name no longer mattered. The church felt colder now, the air heavier, as if even the walls understood what was happening. "You think this ends me?" Gambino hissed, his voice low, venomous, meant for Bumpy alone but sharp enough to cut the silence. Years of dominance, of commanding rooms with a glance, had taught him to snarl when cornered. Bumpy leaned in close, close enough that only Gambino could hear him, close enough that the words landed without witnesses, without echo. "No," he said quietly, calmly, without satisfaction. "You ended yourself." There was no triumph in his tone, only finality. Judgment did not need volume. Judgment simply arrived. The commission did not vote aloud. They did not announce a sentence. They didn't have to. Decisions at that level moved like weather, unseen but unavoidable. Within weeks, the consequences unfolded with ruthless efficiency. Allies who once returned Gambino's calls let them ring unanswered. Meetings were postponed, then forgotten. Accounts that had flowed freely for decades suddenly froze or evaporated. Couriers vanished. Lawyers grew distant. Protection melted away as if it had never existed. Men who once owed him favors now avoided his shadow. The commission stripped him of influence piece by piece, territory by territory, trust entirely. No bullets were fired, no blood stained the streets, yet the damage was total. Carlo Gambino remained alive, breathing, walking, watching the world continue without him, but he was finished. In their world, that was the harsher fate. The Church of St. Cecilia in East Harlem stood like a white stone fortress against the grey September sky of 1953. Inside, the air was thick with incense, lilies, and the low murmur of Italian families who had come to witness what was supposed to be the union of two powerful bloodlines. The bride, Maria Gambino, niece of Carlo Gambino himself, wore silk that shimmered under the stained glass light. The groom, a young underboss from the Genovese crew, stood rigid in his tuxedo, sweat already beading at his temples despite the cool stone walls. 400 guests filled the pews, capos in pinstripes, wives in pearls and veiled hats, children squirming in starched collars, old women clutching rosaries. The organ swelled into the wedding march. The priest raised his hands for silence. Everyone waited for the sacred words. Then the double doors at the back of the nave creaked open. No one turned at first, a late guest perhaps, but the footsteps were slow, deliberate, measured like a man who had all the time in the world. Heads began to swivel. Whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. Bumpy Johnson walked down the center aisle alone. He wore a charcoal suit cut sharp enough to cut glass, a fedora tilted just so, and carried a single wrapped gift box under one arm, white paper, red ribbon, the size of a large shoebox. No bodyguards, no guns visible. Just him, tall, dark-skinned, calm as a judge entering his own courtroom. The aisle seemed to stretch forever under the eyes of 400 people who had spent decades being told that Harlem belonged to Harlem, and Little Italy stayed in Little Italy. A few men reached instinctively inside their jackets. Hands froze when they saw no one followed him. No crew, no threat of immediate violence, just one man. The organist faltered, notes dying mid-chord. The priest cleared his throat, uncertain. The bride's veil trembled slightly. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from the altar. He removed his hat, held it against his chest like a gentleman paying respects. His voice carried clear through the stunned silence, deep, unhurried, the Harlem cadence that made every word feel like velvet over steel. "Congratulations," he said, looking first at the bride, then the groom, then letting his gaze sweep the pews. "Beautiful day for a wedding. I didn't want to miss it." A low murmur rose, confusion, anger, fear. Someone hissed, "Get him out." But no one moved, not yet. Bumpy lifted the gift box slightly. "I brought something for the happy couple, something they'll want to open right now, in front of family. Witnesses make things honest, don't they?" He set the box gently on the carpet at the foot of the steps leading to the altar. Then he stepped back one pace. The groom's face had gone the color of old parchment. Carlo Gambino, seated in the front row on the bride's side, leaned forward. His eyes, usually unreadable, narrowed. Everyone knew the stories. Bumpy had run numbers in Harlem for decades, survived Dutch Schultz, cut deals with Lucky Luciano, kept the Italians at arm's length while bleeding them for tribute. But no one had ever seen him walk into their house like this. The priest glanced at Gambino, seeking permission. Gambino gave the slightest nod. One of the groom's cousins, big man, scarred knuckles, came forward, knelt, and untied the ribbon with shaking hands. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a thick manila envelope, unsealed. On top sat a single photograph, 8 by 10, glossy black and white. The cousins stared, then he recoiled as if burned. He passed the photo to the groom. The groom looked, and his knees nearly buckled. The bride leaned over, saw it, and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. The photo showed her groom, in a hotel room on the west side, naked, entangled with another man. Clear, unmistakable, time-stamped, dated 3 weeks earlier. Behind it, more photos, bank records, wire transfers, proof that the young underboss had been skimming from the family's heroin shipments, diverting money to a private account in Switzerland. Proof that he had been talking to the FBI, names, dates, tape transcripts summarized in neat typewritten pages. Every page was a death sentence. Bumpy spoke again, voice still calm. Proof, he said. Not rumors, not hearsay, proof. The kind that can't be beaten out of someone or buried in concrete. The kind that lives forever once it's seen. He looked directly at Carlo Gambino. You let this man marry into your blood. You let him stand at your table. You let him touch your money. Now you see what he is. Silence pressed down like a physical weight. No one breathed. Gambino stood slowly. His face showed nothing, but those who knew him saw the storm behind the mask. He walked to the box, picked up the envelope, flipped through the pages without hurry. Then he looked at the groom. The groom tried to speak. Carlo, this is a lie, they doctored. Gambino raised one hand. The groom stopped. The old man turned to Bumpy. For a long moment, the two most powerful black and Italian gangsters in New York stared at each other across a church aisle. You could have come quiet, Gambino said, private, between men. Bumpy smiled thinly. Private lets lies breathe, public buries them. Gambino nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. Respect, not friendship. Recognition of a move perfectly played. He turned to his men. Take him out back. Two enforcers grabbed the groom by the arms. He didn't fight. He knew better. They dragged him through a side door while the bride sobbed quietly, veil still in place. The priest crossed himself. Bumpy picked up his hat, placed it back on his head. My gifts delivered, he said to the room. May your marriage be long and honest. He turned and walked back up the aisle. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The organ remained silent. Outside, the September sun had broken through the clouds. Bumpy lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and walked toward the black Cadillac waiting at the curb. His driver opened the door without a word. Behind him, inside the church, the empire cracked, not with gunfire, but with whispers that would spread like wildfire through every family in New York. The wedding never resumed. The guests filed out in stunned clusters, avoiding each other's eyes. The bride was taken home by her aunts. The groom was never seen again in public. Word spread that he had disappeared on a fishing trip upstate. No body, no questions, just gone. Within weeks, the Italian families pulled back from Harlem's numbers racket. The tribute payments that had flowed south for years suddenly stopped. Gambino himself sent a quiet message through back channels. Harlem was Bumpy's. No more incursions, no more muscle. The border was redrawn without a single shot fired. Years later, in smoky back rooms from Brooklyn to the Bronx, old men would tell the story in lowered voices. Not as a tale of blood, but of something rarer, something more terrifying. Power. The kind that didn't need a gun because it carried evidence. The kind that walked into your most sacred moment, laid truth on the altar, and walked out untouched. They called it the wedding that never was. And the man who made it happen became more than a gangster. He became a legend. One that still echoes. Never underestimate the man who brings proof instead of bullets. Because in the end, truth is the sharpest blade of all.